So hello everyone, I'm Jinqi Ying, a PhD student from Trinity College, Dublin. And today, actually my topic's title is slightly different from the schedule. So I will be discussing the development of Old Chinese I and R through the philology of excavated documents. Yes, so in this talk, I will first introduce the background and my overall arguments, and then present the evidence from Western Han excavated documents and even much earlier excavated documents like Warring States manuscripts. And at last, I will offer my conclusions. So first, as we all know, Old Chinese had R and I, which correspond to traditional 鱼部 and 歌部. And in this research, I will not distinguish the common cases of I with those cases originally from AR in Baxter and SOAS Old Chinese. And instead, I will focus on the interactions between Old Chinese R and I, aiming to figure out why there are interactions between them and when this interaction appear in the history of Chinese. So my overall arguments are as follows. So first, within the Qing-Chu dialects by around Middle Warring States periods, which is around the 4th to the 3rd century BCE, I found that Old Chinese I with a medial R has lost its final E, and Old Chinese R still keep itself as R, and maybe the phonetic value is a front vowel R. Second, by around 202 to 186 BCE, the Old Chinese I in type A syllables has lost its final E, and maybe the phonetic value is a back vowel R. And Old Chinese R in type B in type A syllables also still keep it self as R, but maybe the phonetic value is slightly different, and maybe the central R or slightly backward. And by around 163 BCE, the Old Chinese R in type B syllables, which regularly became Middle Chinese 语韵, still keep itself as R. And by around 100 to 87 BCE, the Old Chinese I in type B syllables lost its final ye coda, and maybe the phonetic value of the R is a front vowel, but maybe slightly upper. And the logographs and words I will examine in excavated documents are the 5 examples. So first, it's 个, a general object classifier. Second, 脱, which means white liquor. And the third one is 亏, which means lack. And the fourth one is an interjection, 接. And at last, it's a verb, 拆, which means to heal or cure. So now let's move to the background of this research. So these are the regular Middle Chinese reflexes of Old Chinese R and I, and in the left, it's the reflexes of Old Chinese R. In the right is the reflexes of Old Chinese I. And first, we can focus on the cases I marked in green. So we can notice that both Old Chinese R and I in type A syllables with a medial R have once merged and developed into Middle Chinese A, which is Ma R. And then we can move to the cases in yellow. So both of Old Chinese R and I in type B syllables with acute initials have once merged and developed into Middle Chinese A, which is Ma San, in some unidentified dialects. And then, so there we have noticed that there is a merger of Old Chinese R and I. And then we can also notice that in the right upper side, the Old Chinese I in type A syllables lost its final E and became Middle Chinese R. And then we can think about that at that time, the syllable groups represented by the Old Chinese 歌部 will be as the same one in with the Old Chinese R. So if there is a delay of Old Chinese R, there will be some interactions between them. So that's the general background. And we can conclude that the first case of the context of Old Chinese I and R is because of the merger of Old Chinese R and I in type A syllables with a medial R, or in some unidentified dialects in type B syllables with acute initials. And here I follow I reconstruct it as a front vowel R rather than Baxter as he used it to write "a" in Baxter 1992, and it's because of the later Buddhist data suggests that maybe it's front vowel R. And the second case is monophthongization. So in type A syllables, Old Chinese A lost its final E, and I reconstruct it as so maybe in a later time it became a back vowel R, and it's also slightly different from what Baxter did in 1992. He reconstructed it, changed to the front vowel A before Eastern Han times. And now I will introduce the examples for the delay of Old Chinese R. So those Old Chinese R, which regularly should become Middle Chinese U, U, or Yo. However, some of them are exceptions and became Middle Chinese R and I, which causes such kind of interactions. So we can see from the first example, the Old Chinese word father, with a glottal stop, and its regular Middle Chinese reflex is fu, which is built with a rising tone. However, we have another pronunciation for the father in Middle Chinese, which is ba with a rising tone, and it was written with a new character, ba. And the second example is pu, which means fear in Old Chinese, and it was reconstructed as pus or the like, and its regular Middle Chinese reflex is pu with a departing tone. And however, it also has another Middle Chinese pronunciation as pa with departing tone, and it was written with a new character. So we actually see some examples that there were the delay of Old Chinese R. So let's conclude. Behind the phenomenon of interactions of Old Chinese R and I, there will be, it will involve three major sound changes. First, it's about the merger of I and R, and the second one will involve the delay of Old Chinese R, and also it will involve the loss of final E in Old Chinese I in type B syllables. So now let's move on to review the chronology of the merger of Old Chinese I and R. So generally, scholars believe that this merger has occurred by Eastern Han times, which is around 25 to 220 CE. And such belief was also held by was also held by Proto-Ming researchers. So we know that Proto-Ming keeps the distinction with Old Chinese I and R in Proto-Ming. So Old Chinese I keeps as I in Proto-Ming, and while R keeps as R. With such belief that Proto-Ming researchers believe that Proto-Ming has been distinct with the ancestor of the Middle Chinese by the Eastern Han times. So it will further give us a general belief about the merger of Old Chinese I and R. And however, from the received Western Han poems, we have seen the evidence that there have been the loss of E in Old Chinese, I in Western Han. So scholars like Luo and Zhou found that words with Middle Chinese even tones, such as jia and hua, occasionally rhyme with traditional ge rhyme group words in the Western Han, which is around 202 BCE to 9 CE. However, with those words with Middle Chinese rising tones, such as ma, xia, gua, and ya, they didn't have such rhyming behaviors in the Western Han, and even rare in the Eastern Han. And its four-lay merger has been seen in the Wei Jin period. So from this information, we can get the I monophthongization has appeared in Western Han, and it can be rendered into the following three cases, alphabetic cases. And also, we can know that words with Middle Chinese rising tones should have some phonological peculiarities, and they show a slower sound change compared with those words with Middle Chinese even tones. And so now from the received Western Han poems, we have seen the occasional examples that I, which became Middle Chinese R, and I, and Old Chinese R, which became Middle Chinese L, have rhymed together. However, when did the Old Chinese I begin to lose its final E? Now let's examine the excavated Western Han documents. So the first case is around the word ge, and its Middle Chinese pronunciation is ga with a departing tone. And such Middle Chinese pronunciation supports an Old Chinese reconstruction of I, and then it will make us to establish an etymological relationship with ji, which means odd or single, and it's an Old Chinese I word. And also from the comparative data, we can see the final E. We can find the evidence for the final E. So from the modern dialects, Proto-Ming, Proto-Thai, and Vedic language, we can all this data shows an evidence for I in this word. However, the phonetic of this logograph gu is gu, which belongs to Old Chinese Aram group. So it indicates that when the logograph gu was used to write this morpheme, it should have occurred the sound change I became R. So now our next task is to find out the attestation of this logograph. And I found it in Zhang Jiashan manuscripts, 算术书, which is around 202 to 186 BCE. And there is a passage as 一日伐竹60个. So it means one cuts 60 stalks of bamboo in one day. And in this passage, the logograph ge was used to write this morpheme, one piece of bamboo. And in other Western Han manuscripts, this character was also used to write other morphemes without the final E. So in Ying manuscripts 地点, which is around 179 to 130 BCE, it was used to write a word means to become dry. And in the Ma Wangdui silk manuscripts, it was borrowed to write the morpheme gu, which also didn't have the final E, but belonged to Old Chinese Aram group. Thus, we can conclude that by around 202 to 186 BCE, Old Chinese I and R in type A syllables had been a single rhyme category, with Old Chinese I having lost its final E, and Old Chinese R haven't yet undergone the vowel shift to O or O. The second case is about the word tuo, which means white liquor, and both of its phonetic and its Middle Chinese pronunciation, za, both suggest the Old Chinese I reconstruction. However, this word appears in Ma Wangdui manuscripts as zhu and zhu, both of which has the phonetic qie, which belong to Old Chinese Aram group. So we can find that at that time, the Old Chinese I words should have lost its final E, and at that time, the original Old Chinese A should still keep itself as something like A. So we can conclude that by around 163 BCE, Old Chinese R, which regularly became Middle Chinese U, hasn't yet undergone the vowel shift. And then the following case is around the logograph Hui. So, so from its Middle Chinese Hui, it still suggests an Old Chinese I reconstruction. And also in Warring States Chu, it rhymed with Old Chinese I words. For example, in Chu Ci, there are 3 poems that Hui, that there were a rhyming passage with Kui. So it rhymes with He, Wei, Jia, Yi. All of them are Old Chinese I words. So however, we didn't know how Chu people wrote this word. So maybe Chu people didn't use this logograph to write these I words. And now we will look at the received written forms for this morpheme. So in the 说文解字, Xu Sheng analyzes this character as 从于呼声. So I give both of the Yu and Hu its Middle Chinese pronunciation and its Old Chinese reconstruction. So we can find that the phonetic Hu, which was believed as a phonetic by Xu Sheng, was belonged to Old Chinese Aram group. However, this word itself belongs to Iram group. So there is a contradiction. And also, modern scholars believe that the Yu should be also the phonetic. Like Zhang, he argues that Yu is also the phonetic, and Schussler 2009, he suspects that Yu is perhaps also the phonetic. And in the latest work of Pan Wuyun, he argues that the primary phonetic of this character should be Yu, and the secondary phonetic is Hu. So now let's look at the attestation of Hui of the logograph. And this is a very late character, and I found it in Beijing University manuscripts, 仓颉篇, which is around 100 to 87 BCE. And there is a passage as 逞亏克义, and it was written as this way. So you can find the right component is not the kui, the simplified form of kui, but the original yu. And also, Wang Ning interpreted this passage as 盈亏克义, so maybe gain and loss. And in his interpretation, this logograph writes this word, loss. So we can find that this Old Chinese I words was written by two phonetics belong to Old Chinese Aram group. And then we can conclude that by around 100 to 87 BCE, the Old Chinese I, which became Middle Chinese Ye, and the Old Chinese A, which became Middle Chinese U, were once in a single rhyme category. And the vowel fronting in Old Chinese I became Ye, appears later than this state. So from these Western Han manuscripts, we can conclude that by around 202 to 186 BCE, all Chinese I and R in type A syllables has been in a single rhyme category. And by around 163 BCE, all Chinese R in type B syllables, which became Middle Chinese Y, hasn't yet undergone the vowel shift to R or O. And by around 100 to 87 BCE, all Chinese in type B syllables, which regularly became Middle Chinese Y, and the Old Chinese R, which became Middle Chinese U, were once in a single rhyme category. So now let's move on to earlier excavated documents. And the first case is around the word 接, which is an interjection. And its Middle Chinese pronunciation is 接. And Baxter and Sagar reconstructed it in Old Chinese as 在, which generally based on the phonetic is cha, which belongs to I rhyme group. And in the Arya dictionary, which is around the 3rd century BCE, and there is a passage as 接资接也, and the Guopu comments on it as 今河北人云嗟叹因兔居. So Guo glosses it as the pronunciation of 接 in the north of the Yellow River. They pronounce it as the word 居 net. And its Middle Chinese is also 在, and from the phonetic 且, we should reconstruct it as za in Old Chinese. However, in Guopu's time, it's quite late. So at that time, the Old Chinese I and R have merged. So we cannot know the Old Chinese reconstruction of this word should be whether I or R. And we need to find more evidence for it. So now let's look at the early attestation of the word 接. And I found it in Midwestern Zhou bronze inscriptions. And there is a passage as 王令中曰皆怀疑敢伐内国汝其以陈州师事数于游师. So it means the king orders the men Zhong, saying, alas, the Huai barbarians dare to attack the inner states. You shall dispatch the Chenzhou Shi clans to garrison at You troops. And actually, this passage is at the start of is at the beginning of the bronze inscriptions. So I believe it should be worked as it should be used as an interjection as last, following the interpretation of Yang Shuda and Deng Peilin. And this viewpoint disagree with Zhu and Zhu's paper, because in their paper, they argue this character should be used as a conjunction word. So they believe it should be a connect word. However, there's nothing can be connected with the following sentences, because there's nothing more in before this character. And this argument can also find its additional support in Qinghua manuscripts, 赦命. So in 赦命, there is a passage as 王乎作册人册命博赦皆. So the king summoned the 作册人 to appoint 博赦, and alas, actually it's the ending of the passage. So there's nothing following the character or the word 接. So it must be an interjection rather than a connect word. And in these manuscripts, this word was written as 扎, which is in top-bottom structure rather than the left-right structure as we see in the bronze inscription. However, they are the same. And now we can conclude that from the earlier written forms of this word, which was using the 且, the phonetic 且 belonging to Old Chinese R-rhyme group, this word should be reconstructed as za rather than 在 in Old Chinese Ge rhyme group. And if we follow the Baxter and Sagas conventions, we should write it as a capital A. So our next question is, when this word was written with phonetic originally representing Zai syllables like zuo, cha, cha, it would be the result of the I monophthongization. Because this word is a R word, but it used the I phonetic. And there are various written forms for this word. So in Shanghai manuscripts, like Kongzi Shilun or Li Song, it was written as cha, and it's around before the 278 BCE. And in Ma Wangdui silk manuscripts like Wu Xing and Chen's, this word was written as with the phonetic zuo. And also in a slightly late manuscripts, as in Fuyang manuscripts, it was also written with a character with phonetic zuo, which is in around 165 BCE. And in Beijing University manuscripts Wuji, it was also written with a phonetic cha, which is around 87 to 49 BCE. And in the quite late in Wang Han manuscripts, but it's also in Western Han. And in the Shenwu Fu, which is around 33 to 7 BCE, it was written with the character zuo. So all of this information, so first let's include the reconstruction of the word. It should belong to the Old Chinese Aram group, and in the Warring States Chu manuscripts to Western Han manuscripts, this word was written with an Old Chinese R phonetic. So we can conclude that by around 278 BCE, in the late Warring States Chu, the Old Chinese R had lost its final E in certain words like cha. Meanwhile, some original Old Chinese R, which became Middle Chinese Ye, words like jie didn't undergo vowel raising, which causes the character borrowing between original Old Chinese I and R. And then the second case is around the word chai, which means to heal or cure. And both of its written forms, chai with a phonetic cha and its Middle Chinese pronunciation, we can reconstruct it as I in Old Chinese. However, in Warring States Chu and Qing, first is Warring States Chu manuscripts. It was written a character in 12 phonetic series, which belong to Old Chinese Aram group. So in the around 4th century BCE, this word was written as zha cha in Wangshan Chu manuscripts, and with an addition of the semantic 病字头, which means disease, in abundant manuscripts like Wangshan, Xingcai, and Shanghai manuscripts. So it was used by this character more often. So we can also find there is a contradiction here. The word should be reconstructed as an I word in Old Chinese, but was written as Aram group phonetic. Additionally, this word was also written as a character in Zuo phonetic series, which should represent that in Old Chinese. And in Xingcai Chu manuscripts, it's also with the semantic 病字头. And however, in Shuihu Di Qing manuscripts, this word was written as 做, of which the received pronunciation is zak, so it has a good coda. However, I argue that here we should use the pronunciation of zu rather than the pronunciation of 做, because in Qing Han periods, this logograph 做 was used as a logograph for the word for the morpheme 处 rather than for the 做. So at that time, this word 处 has experiences the sound change from gus to s to h. So at that time, this morpheme and this logograph 处 has belonged to the Old Chinese Aram group. So it makes sense that this word borrow this logograph to write it. And at that time, 睡苦地秦 manuscript 日书 is around the 3rd century BCE. Thus, we can conclude the information from the earlier manuscripts by around 278 BCE in late Warring States Chu. The Old Chinese I had lost its final E, and the Old Chinese A still keeps itself as A, at least in certain words. And now we can push back the time a little earlier. So by around middle stage of Warring States periods, which is around 4th to the 3rd century BCE, Old Chinese I had undergone the monophonization within the Qing dialects, as reflected by the cases of Chai. So now, let me offer my conclusions. So first, it's about the chronology of the loss of E in Old Chinese I. So I argue that by around middle Warring States periods, Old Chinese I had lost its final E within the Qing dialects. And from this, we can further infer that these dialects wouldn't be the ancestor of Proto-Ming, because in Proto-Ming, there still have the distinction of Old Chinese I and A. And there are more notes for the Old Chinese I and A. So by around 202 to 186 BCE, Old Chinese I and A in type A syllables hasn't yet undergone, they have been in a single rhyme category, and the Old Chinese R haven't gone its vowel shift to R or O. And by around 163 BCE, Old Chinese R in type B syllables hasn't yet undergone the vowel shift. And by around 100 to 87 BCE, Old Chinese R in type B syllables and Old Chinese R, which became Middle Chinese U, were once in a single rhyme category. And however, I argue there are slightly different phonetic values for this phoneme R. Yes, and thank you for your listening, and welcome your suggestions and comments.